Hello everybody and welcome back to another installment in the Debunking CTMU Critics series. Today we're going to be looking at this video from Solomon Nelson titled, Did Chris Langan Prove God Mathematically? And we'll see if there are any arguments made against the CTMU, its propositions, or Chris Langan's ability to prove the existence of God, be it logically or mathematically. Let's get into this.
Chris Langan's IQ is apparently somewhere between 190 and 210, and he is the creator of a theory of everything called the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, or the CTMU for short. According to Chris, the theory may well be the single most important work of philosophy, theology, science, and mathematics ever conceived.
Yeah, because it is a philosophical theory of everything. It is a metaphysical theory of everything, which serves as a foundation for what can be discerned to be true or not true, what can be discerned to be valid or not valid. None of these processes or none of the fields which you mentioned, which include processes that are very important pragmatically, can be validated or correctly distinguished or justified. Their existence can be justified if it is not for a metaphysical theory of everything that instantiates an understanding of reality that is complete. Without holes, it is consistent, coherent, descriptive of reality, and adheres to all of the laws of logic, which is what the CTMU is.
And is the best thing since the spoken word. Okay, well, our expectations are high. Let's allow Chris himself to expand on what the CTMU is. It couldn't possibly be simpler. The CTMU is a theory that is not just a theory, but also its own universe and its own model therein. In other words, it is trialic. Triality is an implication of a mathematical property called closure, which is analogous to cosmic self-containment. There is only one way to construct a theory of this kind, as a super-tautology, that is, a tautology with ontological force. To me, this sounds wrong.
To him, it sounds wrong. Let's see if he justifies why any of the propositions stated here are incorrect, or maybe he doesn't understand what these words mean, because maybe he read the CTMU and he still believes it is not clarified. Does he make any of the following statements, or does he justify why he believes it is wrong? Let's find out.
But just to be sure, let me check with an actual mathematician.
Yeah, we're at the buffet right now. Did Chris Langan invent the terms triality and super tautology?
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard them before, but also he admits to doing that. He actually does explain in part, but he doesn't do it in a very satisfactory way at all. He kind of just explains it with more bullshit.
So just to be clear here, what is being said is that Chris Langan is wrong because I made sure with my friend that he also disagrees with what Chris Langan said. And also, Chris Langan made up a word, which is also a justification as to why he is wrong, because my friend also agrees with me that this is wrong. And it subjectively is not satisfactory to him. It just doesn't quite really grind his gear. Yeah, I don't find this a satisfactory argument. It's kind of, it doesn't make any fucking sense. It's funny how he brings up these screenshots as insinuations that the CTMU doesn't have clear definitions of these words, or that they are a bunch of words that Chris Langan made up, wherein every single one of these words is directly defined in the CTMU, which he wouldn't know because he didn't read the CTMU. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, Solomon. I don't know if you know this already or not, but words are, made up.
And invent terms he does. Here is a list of neologisms you'll need to decode if you want to wade through the CTMU quagmire yourself.
Yeah, because all of these neologisms are either conjunctions of prefixes with already established philosophical terms that everybody understands the meanings of, if they know what basic philosophy is, such as self-determinacy, I assume most people know what determinacy is, and self is, pretty explanatory. But in case it wasn't explanatory enough, it is defined within the CTMU, as are all the terms in contextual settings.
The trouble is, if you criticize the CTMU for being incomprehensible, Chris can just say, you're too stupid to understand it, you're too lazy to understand it, or you're lying that you don't understand it.
No, the reason why there would be pushback is because you are making the statement that the CTMU is incomprehensible when there are people that comprehend it. So it is blatantly false. It is just a wrong proposition, just flat out wrong, because there are people that comprehend the CTMU. You are just not one of them. But hey, Solomon, I assume that you are in pursuit of the truth in good faith. And here's the truth for you. Let's represent your argument, your proposition, and disprove it logically. In order for the CTMU to be incomprehensible, no people should be able to understand it. People are able to understand the CTMU. Therefore, the CTMU is not incomprehensible. So you are just flat out deductively wrong.
He never takes our incomprehension to be a problem with his theory.
That's because it's not. Just to be clear, to point out a single problem in the CTMU, the task would be to point out a single falsehood in the CTMU, which this guy cannot do. The capacity for comprehension that you personally have is subjective. There are people that comprehend the CTMU when they've put in enough time into comprehending the CTMU and studying it as much as any other theory would be required for it to be studied in order for it to be comprehended. So the comprehension is not a problem or a qualm with any of the propositions in the CTMU. It doesn't reflect poorly in the CTMU in any shape, form, or form. To reduce it any more would just be removing substance from the theory, which is why the theory is what it is. It is maximally representative of that which it needs in order for the theory to make sense.
Only a problem with us. Some brave souls have tried decoding the CTMU, but they find it lacking. Here's an article by Google software engineer Dr. Mark Chu Carroll, who criticized the CTMU for being based on naive sets and for being unintelligible.
So just to be clear, the proposition that is being made by him, this is the formalization of what he's saying, is that he believes the CTMU to be false because, and that's what he stated earlier, because this person said these three things. So we're going to dive into them and see if they actually make any sense or not. But just to be clear, he hasn't provided a single argument against any of the propositions or principles contained within the CTMU because he hasn't read it. So number one is another proposition of, well, the CTMU just plays word games. Doesn't really mean anything. Word games is not reflective of any of the aspects of the CTMU. You'd have to point out how these word games occur, what they operate upon, and why they obfuscate certain ideas or certain things or what is being said. And it has not been able to do that because there are people that understand the CTMU and are able to show you what is meant by the principles contained within the CTMU. There are a multitude of them. There are multiple channels that explain the CTMU. Do you mind listening to them, maybe? Or maybe reading the CTMU? Further, another counter argument supposedly is that it's a theory with no predictive or descriptive value. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any predictive value. Well, it's not an empirical theory. It's not scientific. It's not supposed to. Or descriptive value. It does have descriptive value because it explains and describes the fundamental nature of reality. Let's take the reality principle, for instance, which directly describes, which is what descriptive means, by the way. When I talk about word games, I'm not sure you don't even know what the word descriptive means. The word descriptive means to describe something in reality. The reality principle is the most general principle that is required to have any model of reality, and that is reality contains all of that which exists. So this is just another false statement. 2. The CTMU's axioms are never stated. This is perhaps the most ignorant statement that you could ever possibly make about a paper or a theory, literally ever. The CTMU is quite literally a representation of every axiom required for reality to exist. And those are the principles contained within it, such as the reality principle, for example. That's an axiom. It is a necessary axiom. And this criticism would only even work if the CTMU was merely a formal system. It's not. It's a metaformal system. And Chris Langan has extensively talked about this. You wouldn't know this because you didn't read the CTMU. And just to go further and disprove this syllogistically, it says every possible statement is provable in an unsound theory, and the CTMU is an unsound theory. Well, the statement that reality doesn't exist within the CTMU is not possible. It's not a possible statement to be made. Therefore, the CTMU is not an unsound theory by your standard, because it can't prove every single possible statement. Every single possible statement can't be proved within it. Therefore, it is not an unsound theory. Again, these people are just fucking clueless. And the third point is just a scraping for any modicum of reply or comeback in any capacity. Is, well, the author, he just doesn't understand these things. No demonstration as to what he said being wrong. No demonstration as to what he said and how it is wrong. But he just doesn't understand what syntax and semantics is, despite the fact that he extensively applies it in his theory, between objects and models, despite the fact that he extensively applies it in his theory, and the statement of facts, which he extensively applies in his theory. And because of that, the statements made are just meaningless. Well, how is it the case that these statements are meaningless? Can you demonstrate any of these claims? Of course not.
Chris actually responded to this article, mostly by attacking Mark's character instead of addressing his criticisms.
So the insinuation is that he did not address his criticisms. So either he addressed his criticisms or he didn't. Mostly doesn't make any sense. This is not a bimodal scale. Okay? You either address the criticisms that somebody has or you don't. And Chris did address every single criticism that this guy made. It just happens to be the case that every single one of them is dubious and is worthy of an evaluation of the personal character of the person that's making these claims and the capacity of whether they are good faith or not. And it happens to be the case that every single time these people make these propositions is they haven't read the CTMU, and it's just inconvenient for them because they my brain hurts reading. I can't, just halt for me.
Notably, Chris established criteria of what makes a good critic, according to which Mark obviously failed. If this sounds like ad hominem to you, you'd be right.
You'd be absolutely wrong, because an ad hominem is about using an insult in substitution for an argument. Nowhere in here was that done. It was merely an evaluation of the criterion for that which instantiates what makes somebody a good critic or a valid critic, and the criticism was all addressed.
Chris uses personal attacks a lot.
Only after people call him a literal fraud and dismiss his theory without any basis in evidence and any actual valid criticism other than me not understand. And, well, yeah, it is kind of valid. It also would not be an ad hominem fallacy either in this scenario, because an ad hominem fallacy is using insults in substitution for an argument. Chris has always addressed the arguments. He's also used insults to respond to insults, yeah.
Chris then entered a debate with an anonymous poster with the alias Rubix, whom he called Slimy Little Rubix of Wall Street, and whom he later accused of being Mark himself. This was the last straw for Mark, who, after tolerating over 70 caustic essay-length posts by Chris, decided to ban him, calling him a lying jackass with delusions of grandeur. Aside from defending a theory of everything that has no real-world applicability, that can't make predictions, that isn't experimentally verifiable, and that inscrutably confounds maths and metaphysics,
absolutely none of which in any shape, way, or form or capacity is relevant whatsoever, because the CTMU is not a scientific theory. Saying that the CTMU doesn't have practical applicability or empirical predictions to make is the same as saying that you can't use a barbell for drawing. Yeah, that's kind of not the function. It's like, yeah, you can't use a water hose to ignite a fire. Yeah, that's kind of like not the function of the theory. It's a metaphysical theory. It's a philosophy, right? It also doesn't confound metaphysics with mathematics. It conjoins them because they are necessarily coupled and linked, which he explains in the CTMU, which we have every single reason under the sun to believe you did not read in any shape, way, or form, because you held it to a scientific standard for some weird fucking reason, when it's a philosophy. Yeah, dude, go read Arthur Schopenhauer's book and say, well, it doesn't really have any practical real-world implications. This is so stupid.
What else has Chris done? He once went on a game show.
Chris, do you want the money or do you want the model?
He worked as a bouncer and now breeds horses. He posts about conspiracy theories and how gorillas are apparently smarter than Somalis.
Notice how absolutely none of this is relevant to whether the CTMU proves the existence of God mathematically. In no shape, form, or form is this relevant. It's not a refutation to any principle within the CTMU. It's not a refutation to any proposition within the CTMU, be it mathematical or logical. In no shape, way, or form is it relevant to even the very topic of the title of this guy's video. It is merely an attempt at a character assassination by appealing to emotion and saying, these are a bunch of arguments that feel like they're bad because like it feels like they're racist. Even these arguments or propositions that Chris has made in these statements, he hasn't even refuted those, nor would he have any reason to in this video because it's not relevant to the topic. It is merely an attempt at character assassination to try to validate some point that is actually tangential to the very topic of his video because he doesn't have any justification to his proposition that the CTMU is false. And that's because he's a fucking retard.
He believes greater cranial circumference equals greater intelligence.
Take a larger-headed creature, a monkey, even smarter than a house cat. Now take a really large-brained creature like a man, smarter still. My own personal opinion is, yes, head size does influence intelligence.
He purports to be able to solve the P versus NP problem, for which a $1 million prize is offered, but that his proof wouldn't be accepted by the elitist Millennium Prize Committee anyway. He believes academia is a nepotistic brainwashing institute, and that academics are out to bury the CTMU because it's against their interests. Why do I point this out? It's not to belittle Chris. It's not to bemoan his wasted potential or to trash IQ as a measure of brains. I point this out because I think we've mishandled Chris. We criticize him for failing at logic or science.
Neither of which has happened, by the way. He's not demonstrated a single one of the claims that he's made within the video. Not even confined to these claims. I'm using this as a generalized brush, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section. He has not made a single statement in this video which he's been able to justify. Not one. Including the one that Chris Langan has failed at logic. Yeah, you know what would be a great demonstration of that? If you could actually demonstrate it, it would be if we go through the CTMU in relation to the very title of your video and go through how it is the case that the CTMU does not actually mathematically prove the existence of God. That would be a demonstration of the means by which Chris Langan has failed in his endeavor of pursuing a logical or metaphysical theory of everything through the means of logical induction. You can't do that because it doesn't exist.
Whereas I think he's better understood as a conceptual artist.
Notice that this is an implicit dismissal of the theory of the CTMU without actually justifying why it is the case that the CTMU has failed in its logical endeavors. We'll just accept Chris as a conceptual artist because he's obviously failed as somebody that is trying to attempt at a logical theory of everything, which has not been demonstrated. How about you demonstrate that he's failed at that, because he has not.
The CTMU, with its belligerent style of defense, is like conceptual art. Of course, Chris wouldn't accept that it's an artwork, but I think he's said enough to let on Remember when he described his theory as a super tautology? That is, a tautology with ontological force. Well, what is a tautology with ontological force? You could say it's a poem. In a poem you say something we already know, like that death is grim or that love is passionate, but you frame it in a way that animates the idea, or gives it ontological force, if you like. The CTMU is absurd.
So the CTMU is absurd. Why does Solomon hold this to be his belief? Why does he hold this to be the case? Well, because he spoke to his mathematics friend. He spoke to his friend who is a major in math, and he also agreed that the CTMU is absurd. So this is a logical justification. Of course it's a logical justification. You know what else is a logical justification as to why the CTMU is absurd? Well, I just don't really understand it. It's not really up to my taste, so to say. I can't really comprehend it that easily from the couple of forum posts that I read. And also, it just fails at everything. You know, really, it just does. You don't need to ask. It just does. It just does. Because, like, Chris Langan said some things about, like, Somalis and IQ. It just makes sense, bro.
That's the tautology, but when Chris leads his critics on a merry dance and makes them live the absurdity, there emerges the ontological force. Meanwhile, the rest of us get to sit back and appreciate that confronting the absurd is actually very amusing and ultimately gratifying.
Irrelevant, facetious, doesn't really have any substance or argument or counter-argument, literally anything. You know, funnily enough, we talk about nothing in the context of metaphysics. There is literally nothing here. Absence of thing. There's not been a single argument made ever in this video. Not one. Not one. He would not be able to name a single argument against a single principle contained within the CTMU. And hey, listen, if the CTMU is so full of shit, there are over 16 defined principles within the CTMU that directly state what they mean. You should be able to point out flaws in at least one. Why doesn't he do that? Because he's fucking full of shit. Now, insofar as the super tautology is concerned, I know the implicit inference here is that super tautology doesn't actually mean anything. It's not referential to something in reality, but it does mean something, dude. That's why there is the word. Super tautology, a tautology with ontological force, refers to the reality principle. You know what that is? The reality principle is one of the most foundational principles within the CTMU. It states that reality contains all of that which exists. And so in that capacity, in order for reality to generate itself, it must by means of itself be a brute fact. There is nothing external to reality from which it can generate its ontological status, from which it can generate its being. That's why it's a super tautology. It is essential for its very existence, and it comes only from reality. That's why it's tautological. It's self-referential. This is very simple stuff if you just, you know, read the CTMU. Now, this is also the end of the video, so we will do a quick recap of all the arguments against the CTMU that just easily dictate and highlight how on a surface level the CTMU is jargon and doesn't have any justification for any of its proclamations or propositions in any way, right? And the arguments in this very grandiose, intellectual, sophisticated, logically coherent and rigorous expression and manifestation is expressed solely in one. My friend that is a major in maths agrees that the CTMU is false. 2. The CTMU is false because I can't understand it. 3. The CTMU can't be understood because I can't understand it. 4. Chris Langan made fun of people that made fun of him. 5. Chris Langan talked about Somalis. Now, if this is not satisfactory enough to you to stray you away from the notion that the CTMU is indeed a descriptive theory of everything in a metaphysical sense, then I don't know what to tell you. Because if you don't believe that the CTMU is false because Solomon Nelson doesn't understand it, you're in for a rude awakening.